On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson. Been a lot going on with shipping recently. We've been following a lot with global shortages, blockages of the Suez Canal, ship fires, you name it. It's been happening this year. Every year you think 2020 couldn't have been bad, then rolls in 2021. But what I want to do is take a moment and look back and reflect. Beyond being a former merchant mariner, I'm also a historian. And one of the things I like to do is take a moment and look at history, how we got to where we are. And in particularly, what I want to do today is take a look back 100 years to an event that happened in the history of the United States, the passage of a piece of legislation known as the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. It is sometimes referred to as the Jones Act, but it is much more than just coastal U.S. shipping. In fact, the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 was the United States' first national maritime strategy. So today on What's Going On with Shipping, we're going to go back 100 years and take a look at the Jones Act, the Shipping Act of 1916, and the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano, former merchant mariner, chair of the Department of History, Criminal Justice, and Political Science at Campbell University, and an adjunct instructor in maritime industry policy at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. So before we jump into the history, let's talk a little bit about what's going on right now and the context about this. One of the reasons I started this channel was because of my maritime background. When I was a mariner, I graduated in 1989 from the State University of New York Maritime College, one of 6 state maritime academies located in the United States, plus the Federal Academy at Kings Point. I immediately got a job sailing. And in 1990 to 91, I was involved in Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I was third officer on board the hospital ship Comfort. And while in the Persian Gulf, I witnessed something I'd never seen before, which was the transportation and movement of a massive military force into the Persian Gulf. It was amazing. It was just absolutely, I can remember being in the port of Dammam and seeing the entire laydown of the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions of the 7th Corps of the U.S. Army sitting there. It's something I never will ever forget. And it really got my interest going in how we got to where we are today. Right now, we're in the midst of a global economic, just it's hard to put in the words. Sometimes I get lost on trying to explain it. There's so much going on with shipping. If you've been following the channel and if you've been following it since March, number one, thank you again. I appreciate it. We're up over 8,500 subscribers. Viewers are great, and please keep sharing it, because one of the things that I hope to do is to get more context out there for what's going on with shipping. So right now, this is a story that just came out from Splash 247, the Sam Chambers, talking about the value of the global merchant fleet hits a new all-time high. The global merchant fleet is now worth $1.2 trillion, having risen by 26% in the year to date. It's an amazing jump. He talks about the fact that the value had fluctuated between $850 billion and $1 trillion for most of the previous decade. And it stood at $700 billion back in 2010. And the world's merchant fleet has just increased exponentially in cost. The demand is up. Demand is up for almost nearly every ship out there. And that's because trade is up. Trade is up, and we're seeing trade moving. We talked about this thing that trade has only moved up a couple of percentage points, but it's the volume of that percentage point. A few percentage points of a lot is a lot. And that's one of the things we're seeing. Over 11 billion tons of cargo moving annually, probably close to 12 billion tons now. And so we're seeing that happen right now. We're just seeing the need to move goods magnify over everything. And then you have this story. This is out of G Captain. This is Mike Schuller. Imports sustained surge at Port of Los Angeles as exports continue to crash. Port of Los Angeles did its quarterly report. It's a link to it right here. You can catch the head of the Port of Los Angeles talk about that. But one of the big things that they talk about is the crashing of exports. Exports are not moving. And he says right here in this report, while loaded imports in July rose 2.9%, exports did not fare so well. Loaded exports decreased 27.6% compared to the same period last year. And this is a big issue. U.S. exports are not going out. This basically leads to a massive shortfall in basically our imports versus exports. And this basically goes to our trade deficit. We're not shipping goods out. And again, we've talked about this quite a bit on the video. If you hadn't seen it, go back to some previous episodes where we talk about this. The big shipping liner companies, the top 10 that control 85% of all container spots in the world's oceans, they're prioritizing empty containers over American exports. Another story right here from G Captain. Port congestion double whammy sinks carriers' hopes of schedule recovery. Again, we're still being slammed right now. Even though we had the shutdown and slowdown in one port in Ningbo, we're still seeing that it's not enough to slow down the amount of goods that need to get checked. We have massive queues, lines in ports off of Los Angeles, Long Beach. Matter of fact, the biggest one right now just happened. And all of this is really impacting you as the consumer. We've talked about the fact that Christmas goods are going to be short, that there's shortages on the shelves. Go to your big box stores, go to Walmart's, go to Home Depot's and everything. We just heard that not only is Home Depot chartering a vessel, but now Walmart's going to charter vessels. And so this is having a huge impact. But in the midst of all this, we see some movement. Two U.S. congressmen, John Garamendi, a Democrat from California, and Dusty Johnson, Republican from South Dakota, are pushing through legislation, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021, trying to give more power to the Federal Maritime Commission to oversee these foreign companies that are basically controlling American exports. Now, there's other congressmen pushing legislation. Senator Mike Lee from Utah is pushing legislation that's in favor of some shipping companies, and particularly the big cruise lines, Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian. He wants to see the Passenger Vessel Service Act removed because he wants to see, passenger cruise vessels going again. My only issue with that is those three companies, Carnival, Royal Caribbean, Norwegian, are not American companies. They're, Carnival is incorporated in Panama, Royal Caribbean in Liberia, and Norwegian in Bermuda. And even though they get their headquarters right down there in Florida, within 20 miles of each other in southern Florida, not American companies. And Garamendi and Johnson are trying to pass legislation to kind of help this. But the issue here is an underlying issue, is really the absence of American ships in trade. The U.S. Merchant Marine at the end of World War II was the largest merchant marine in the world, carried over 60% of the world's goods. It was number one. It was number one in the world. Where is it today? It's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. You were starting to ask good questions. I like when my viewers and my students ask good questions. This is from the review of Maritime Transport 2020. And right here, you see the top 10 countries with flags of registry. And of course, top 10, the U.S. got to be in it. No, they're not. Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malta, China, Bahamas, Greece, Japan. We're not in the top 10. Well, let's zoom out here a little bit. There we go. Let's go. Okay, well, here's 17. I mean, we got to be here, right? We got to be somewhere in here. Keep going down the list. Cyprus, no. Indonesia, nope. Isle of Man. Where's the Isle of Man? It's actually off Great Britain. It's an open registry flag for the British. Danish International Registry, Norwegian International Registry. This is the Danes and the Norwegians attempt to circumvent their own flags and use foreign crews. Let's see what else we got here. Madeira, which is the Portuguese Open Registry. Nope. The Islamic Republic of Iran, number 17. Still no sign of the United States. Let's keep going. Nope, went the wrong way here. Let's keep going. Let's see. 18, India. 19, Republic of Korea. 20, Saudi Arabia. And then 21, there you go. The United States of America at number 21. We are the 21st largest country in terms of merchant marine fleets. We have the number one Navy in the world, although you can make arguments that in terms of ships and numbers, you may be able to measure that. But I think in terms of capability, of projection power, nobody holds a candle to the United States Navy. But are we a true maritime power if we have the number one Navy in the world, but the number 21 merchant marine in the world? It's a good question. China, if you take actually Hong Kong and the Chinese registry right there, put it together, they're number 2 in the world, right behind Panama. Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands, all open registries. what are sometimes referred to as flags of conveniences, FOX. All of them were created by the United States. Panama was created in the years leading up to World War II as an attempt to circumvent neutrality laws. Liberia was created at the end of World War II, going into the Cold War, to get a foothold into Africa, to give Liberia, which was then the only free state in the Africa, except for Ethiopia, and then the independence given to South Africa and later on to Egypt. But Liberia was an attempt to give Liberia an economy. And so shipping was seen as a great one to do it. And a lot of companies shifted over into Liberian flag. Due to issues in Panama and Liberia, it was realized that this was a little bit of instability. And in the 1980s, the Marshall Island flag was created, which was great for American companies because the Marshall Islands is basically a protectorate of the United States. The U.S. has an agreement to basically protect Marshall Island ships, the territory, everything. And in turn, we get free basing and all these other rights in the Marshall Islands. So, being Marshall Island flag is great. You basically get the protection of the United States, but you don't have to abide by U.S. laws. You don't have to abide by U.S. employment laws. You don't have to abide by U.S. regulations. And so the Marshall Islands develops as an open registry. And the U.S. now is down to 21. And if you break it down, this is the MARAD list. This is the most recent list they have in terms of vessels over 1,000 gross tons, which I would also argue is this, even though the Maritime Administration put this out, it's never 100% accurate for a variety of reasons. There's some vessels missing from this. Offshore vessels, for example, offshore supply vessels, which are over 1,000 gross tons, are not in this list. The Pride of America, which is a passenger liner, is not in this list for some reason. But here they are, 181 ships. That's 181 ships left in the U.S. fleet. 96 are under the Jones Act, which is the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. Section 27, this basically is the protected trade aspect. And then 85 are out in non-Jones Act, largely international trade. This is not great. This is not great. And this is the subject that I took on a paper I presented back in June to the Propeller Club of Washington, D.C., and it's part of a larger academic paper that I am working on to present at the McMullen Naval History Symposium in September up at the U.S. Naval Academy. So I'm not going to try to bore you with an academic paper and just kind of read slides. I never like to do that, to tell you the truth. I like to present in much the same way I've been doing these videos for all of you. So I take the premise that the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 is really America's first national maritime strategy. Yes, we've had naval strategies in the past, but we've never had a maritime strategy. What do I mean by a maritime strategy? A maritime strategy looks at not just military, but also commercial. And I think this is a very pertinent argument. Just last year, the Navy, it was earlier this year, excuse me, losing track of time here. In March of 2021, the U.S. Basically put out what they call the Tri-Service Maritime Strategy. And this Tri-Service Maritime Strategy was a strategy, and they've been doing this for a while now. It's a compilation of the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard putting together a maritime strategy. And what I have here is a couple of comments from that strategy, but in particular is a comment by one of these critiques of this strategy, Blake Hertzinger, who's out in Singapore, a Navy officer who's working academically right now out there. But Blake puts in here the fact that one of the things missing from the Tri-Service Maritime Strategy is the commercial side. Now, Blake focuses on sea lift aspect. This is the military element of commercial shipping, but I'd argue there's a commercial element missing from this. You cannot have a maritime strategy by definition without a commercial aspect to it. If you do, you're just having a naval strategy with a little bit of maritime mixed on top. It's not a true maritime strategy. And really the first maritime strategy we see is this act in 1920. Let me get my mug out of the way here because you guys do not need to see this. I'd rather you focus on what's here. There we go. So this is the preamble to the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And again, the focus today, if you bring up the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 or the Jones Act, what most people will talk about is Section 27 of this bill, even though there's 29 sections of it. They will focus on Section 27, which talks about the coastal trade. But if you read this section here, it talks about a couple of things. Number one, it says that it's necessary for the national defense and the proper growth of its foreign and domestic commerce that the U.S. shall have a merchant marine of the best equipped and most suitable type of vessels sufficient to carry the greater portion of its commerce. So right off the bat, one of the things that the U.S. really realizes is that it needs a merchant marine that can carry its commerce, particularly in the international trade. And I'll talk about why that's an issue in a second. The second issue is to serve as a naval or military auxiliary in time of war or national emergency. This is 1920. This is just 2 years after the end of the First World War. World War I, which had gripped the world, sucked us in 1917. And one of the issues was specifically dealing with shipping, which I'll come back to. And so it goes on to here. It says, hereby declare to be the policy of the United States to do whatever may be necessary to develop and encourage the maintenance of such a merchant marine. And in so far as may not be consistent with the express provisions of the Act, for the United States Shipping Board shall, in the disposition of vessels and shipping property, and it goes on here, making rules and regulations, the administration of shipping laws. Basically, for the first time, the United States has a federal entity, what was then known as the U.S. Shipping Board. Today, it's known as the Maritime Administration and the Federal Maritime Commission. So the Maritime Administration, the Federal Maritime Commission comes out of this. If you look at the specifics of this bill, there's a lot in this bill. One of the first things it does is it brings together a series of bills, in particularly the protection of merchant mariners. One of the things that the United States had done was really proactive, was the protection of its merchant mariners. There was a law, there's a Supreme Court decision back in the early 1890s that really relegated merchant mariners into a position of servitude. Basically, what was known as the Arago decision basically said that merchant mariners, when they signed on to international voyages, signed away their decision to leave a vessel. Basically, they signed away their 13th Amendment rights. They basically became slaves of the ship. And the Seamen's Act of 1915 basically fixed that, but it was codified here in this bill. And to this day, you'll hear of Jones Act lawyers that basically do this for the protection of mariners. The other thing this does is deals with the shipping board's massive fleet of vessels that were built during World War I. During World War I, there's a massive shipbuilding program that's undertaken by the United States. And this shipbuilding program, unfortunately, pales in comparison to what's done in World War II, but it's substantial. And most importantly, this building program that's done in World War I is a direct threat to the British Empire. The largest merchant marine in the world on the eve of World War I was the British. They controlled almost 50% of the world shipping. Second was the Germans. They're gone because of World War I. And then third was the United States. Well, at the end of World War I, as you'll see, the U.S. merchant marine is rapidly gaining on the British. And more importantly, the Americans have a technological edge that the British do not have. The British ships are fueled by coal. Why coal? Coal is plentiful in Great Britain. It's basically a coal rock in the middle of the North Sea. And the British have bases and waypoints and geopolitical strategic areas, Gibraltar, the Suez, Singapore, where they can stockpile coal. Coal by nature is not as efficient as something like oil, but coal is cheap for its time. And as long as there's enough coal around, you can sail a vessel halfway around the world, load cargo, take on a load of coal, and come back to Great Britain. The Americans had a big problem. They couldn't do that because they didn't have coaling stations around the world. So they had a real hard time competing on the international market. That changes. The shipping board during World War I, when they build ships, their vessels are not coal-fueled, they're oil-fueled. Technological advantage. Oil can be stored in the double bottoms of vessels, and more importantly, it's better in terms of energy. You get more heat, you get more BTUs, which means you get more range, which means when you put a load of oil in the double bottoms of a vessel, you don't impact the cargo areas because you're putting them in the double bottoms of the vessel. You actually have longer range. Now, these new U.S. shipping board vessels can sail across the Pacific and back, across the Atlantic and back. They can sail almost around the world. And now they can compete with the British. It was a huge problem. The British saw them as a huge, massive threat. And one of the things that the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 aimed to do was to sell off that fleet of vessels built during World War I and put it on essential lines, basically designated strategic routes. The U.S. wanted to make sure it had vessels competing against the British and other nations on the world's marketplace. And so the U.S. is going to go ahead and put these vessels on this route. This report here also comes with this little bit of information. This is from the U.S. Shipping Board report for 1920. And they have these great little graphs in here. And I want to show you some of these graphs. So the one on the left here talks about the size of the U.S. merchant marine, tonnage employed in foreign trade. So the chart on the left there shows you the size of the U.S. merchant marine every 10 years, roughly from 1800 to 1910, and then 1917 to 1920. On the right here is the percentage or the amount of tonnage in foreign trade. For most of its history, a large majority of the U.S. ships are in foreign trade, right up until about 1860. And right there at the Civil War is where things change. Why does it change? Well, two things. Number one, Civil War happens, and Americans' focus goes from being external to internal. We look inward. We start basically colonizing the continent. Westward expansion, manifest destiny, basically focuses inward. Second thing is a change in technologies. Now, most people will sit there and tell you, well, it's the British are converting to steam and iron, and the Americans are still wood and sail. If you look at American naval vessels in the 1870s, 1880s, they're still using sail. Why? Because they're coal-fired, and there's not enough coal, American coal, around the world. So Americans cannot compete with the British. And so the American merchant marine declines in foreign trade. It still grows. I mean, there's a huge steam-powered force on the American rivers along the coast. The American merchant marine is still substantial on the eve of of World War I. We're the third largest in the world. About 11% of the world's merchant force is out there. But again, we're focused on coastal, internal, the Caribbean. We're not really on the high seas. We're not at crossing the Atlantic. A few vessels are passenger vessels, some in the Pacific, but not a lot. But the thing that scares, and this middle one kind of shows you the same thing. It shows you the percentage of value carried in American bottoms versus foreign bottoms. But it's this slide on the right that scares them. It shows you the size, even though it's a little hard to read. I understand that. What you got to do is look at this little dot right there. That's the amount of shipping built between 1813, 1819, 1820 to 29. And then like every decade, the amount of ships built. And then all of a sudden you get 1918, and you can see how that just absolutely blows out. And then 1919 is even bigger. And I'll tell you, even 1920 is bigger than that. The American shipbuilding program scared the British to death. We talk about post-World War I, the naval arms race, the battleship race, the dreadnought holiday. But in truth, one of the other things the British were terrified of is the Americans were going to come out in full bore on the high seas and just challenge them in a way that they had not been challenged before in terms of commercial vessels. Go back here. What is the trigger for us to get into World War I? Well, it's the submarine. It's unrestricted submarine warfare. In 1917, the Germans begin sinking American ships. We see American ships being sunk. 10 of them are sunk between February 1st and April 6th, when the Americans declare war on Germany. Great book, Rodney Carlisle's U.S. Merchant Ships and American Entry into World War I, Sovereignty at Sea. I strongly recommend it. It's a great book. But one of the things that gets us into this war is the sinking of our vessels. And one of the things that the World War I demonstrated to us was our overdependence on foreign shipping. In 1914, nearly all our exports were handled by British, German, and other European, Japanese vessels. And then World War I broke out. We didn't get involved until 3 years later, but all of a sudden our exports were piling up on the dock. We could not get them on vessels. Why? The German vessels disappeared, or they went into, they were interned in American ports or other neutral ports. And at the same time, the British vessels and other Allied vessels were diverted for the wartime mission. And what happened was American goods piled up on the docks. Sounds fairly familiar, doesn't it? And all of a sudden, you look around and all of a sudden American exports can't get out. Why? Because there aren't American ships to carry them. And that's exactly what we see happening. Give you an idea, to move cotton at the start of, before World War I started, it was about 35 cents a ton. It cost you 35 cents to move a ton of cotton. Within a few months, it jumps to $6.10 a ton. The value to charter a ship increases 20-fold. And the US now realizes that it's in problems. Now, fortunately for the United States, it still had a large merchant marine. It was mainly in the coastal trade. If you look at the 10 ships that are sunk during this period when unrestricted submarine warfare was resumed in 1917, many of those were coastal vessels diverted into international trade, or vessels that had been interned and grabbed by the Americans or sold by the Germans or the Austrians so that the Americans could use them. Some of them were sailing vessels. Americans were still operating sailing vessels, again, because American vessels in the international trade could not obtain coal. So that was a big issue. But now all of a sudden, the United States has vessels out there and they become targets for the Germans. And one of the things that was realized was we need more ships. Problem was the American economy was just gearing up. We were starting to benefit from that. Shipyards were getting at capacity, and what was needed was an infusion of more cash. And so in 1916, the United States passes the Shipping Act, which basically was an effort to create the shipping board to basically facilitate construction and operation of more American ships. Unfortunately, by the time the shipping board is coming online, the war is declared and they needed something else. And there was mismanagement initially with it. But eventually they create the Emergency Fleet Corporation, which is given a $50 million to start building American ships. And basically what they do is they go to all these yards around the United States and have them start building ships to the designs of those in the shipyard. And they start pumping out vessels. And this leads to what's called the Bridge to France. One of the most unheralded people in the war is this guy right here in the center. This is Edward Hurley. Edward Hurley is the chairman of the War Shipping Board. He's the head of the U.S. Shipping Board, United States Shipping Board, but he's also the head of the War Shipping Board. And he comes up with an elaborate plan to figure out how we're going to get these troops and equipment across the Atlantic to the United States. He basically undertakes a five-pronged approach. Number one, he commandeers all U.S. shipyards in the United States and the 431 ships that are currently under construction. Over half of them are being built for allies, which actually angers the crud out of the British, for example, because some of those vessels were just about done. They were being built for the British government, although the British government could not technically do that. So they were being built for canard for the British government. Hurley will requisition all domestically flagged ships over 2,500 gross tons. He seizes, number three, all the German and Austrian ships in American ports and puts them to use. The fourth one, he contacts neutral nations and allied governments for additional shipping. So, for example, in some like Central American, South American ports, there were some German and Austrian vessels. They obtain those. They get some vessels from neutral countries, Norway, from Denmark, and eventually from the Netherlands, and then some allied nations like Japan, for example. One of the things Japan had was a massive shipbuilding industry, but it lacked steel. One of the big misconceptions about Japan, even in World War II, was they couldn't build ships fast. They could. They just lacked the raw material, and particularly steel. And so the Japanese hacked out a deal to build ships for the U.S. Shipping Board, but what they wanted was 2 tons of steel for every 1 ton of ship they built. So basically, enough to build a ship for the United States and one for themselves. And Hurley oversees this amazing program that's extremely successful. If you look at what happens during World War I, they start building ships in record time. What happens, Bud, is the Germans kind of fall on their face. They launch this maritime attack in 1917. They hope to strangle the Allies off. It's unsuccessful, largely because of the implementation of convoying, the deployment of American destroyers to Europe in conjunction with British destroyers, the building of new vessels, and basically the Allies are able to basically counter the Germans so that when the Germans launched their spring offensive in 1918, there's already American divisions in place to stymie them. And then literally in March of 1918, it opens like a tidal wave, and the British are able to divert 124 ships to help ship over about 36 American divisions, joining the 6 that had previously been shipped over. And by the time the war ends, there are 43 American divisions in France. But the war was meant to go on to 1919, 1920. Nobody knew. And so the United States has got this huge, massive building program in place, and they're pumping out ships. For example, up here in the upper left, this is launchings at what is then Hog Island, what is today the Philadelphia International Airport. Back then, it was the American International Shipbuilding Corporation. What had been a desolate swamp, but in a short period of a few months, has 50 shipways on board. And unlike traditional shipyards, which smelt the steel and form it and do all that work, these shipyards in Hog Island, the Merchant Shipbuilding Corporation and the Submarine Boat Corporation along the Delaware River Valley, the Carolina Shipbuilding Corporation down in North Carolina, they are prefabrication yards. The same technology that will be used in World War II to build the Liberty ships are used to build these vessels during World War I. And while many of these ships, for example, at the Hog Island yard, aren't built in time to come out to fight the war, they become the backbone of the U.S. Merchant Marine during the interwar years. And the United States has this massive fleet. Now, not all of the building is successful. There are wooden vessels that are built that are really not at all successful. If you want to see the remnants of them, go to Mallows Bay in Maryland. You can see the remnants of some of those wooden ships, and even the concrete building ships were not very successful. But one of the things that comes out of this is this determination that the U.S. needs a comprehensive maritime strategy. And that's where these three men play that role. On the left there is William S. Benson. He was the first chief of naval operations, and he succeeds Edward Hurley as the head of the U.S. Shipping Board. And in March of 1920, he says this: constant protection can come only from an ample navy and a permanent merchant marine under our own flag. A merchant fleet of adequate size for a peacetime commerce manned by American citizens whose loyalty will keep them at their posts when danger comes, and whose experience will equip them for higher office in our non-combatant fleet when it serves as an auxiliary to our Navy, is not a mere instrument of commerce, it is necessity. Benson gives you the national defense argument for why the United States needs a merchant marine. I have to tell you that the U.S. military, since the end of World War II, has not really thought about that. And largely because the U.S. military hasn't had to worry about threats to its supply lines. If you look during the Cold War and up until very recently, the U.S. never worried about that. Korea, Vietnam, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and even Iraq and Afghanistan, it never worried about its supply lines. It didn't worry about the maritime supply lines. There was a little bit of a threat during the Cold War, but even that was seen as minimal because it had NATO and it had allies. But now the United States realizes that having a merchant marine that's 21st in the world with threats that are out there like the Russians, the Chinese, and other threats that are out there, both conventional and asymmetric, poses a big problem. Benson's talking about this 100 years ago. Then on the right, that's Congressman William Stedman Green, Republican from Massachusetts. And Green is the one who actually initiates the Merchant Marine Act. It's called the Jones Act because of Wesley Jones there in the center. But in truth, Green is the one who pushes through an act. Both these guys, Green and Jones, have abundant hearings. I mean, thousands of pages of testimony in 1919, 1920. One of the myths you hear about the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 is that it's pushed through and there's no debate. That's complete, utter falsehood. Happy to send everybody to links to the congressional record where they can read this, and also to the expert testimony that was done. Green writes this: I believe the question of the American merchant marine is the most important question that has been brought to the attention of the House. Green in 1919, 1920 is going to push through a bill that will eventually be morphed with a bill coming out of Jones's committee that together creates the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And then there's Senator Wesley Jones, Republican from Washington. Jones writes this: when the war began, we had practically no ships under the American flag on the high seas, which is exactly true, but we had a ton in the coastal trade. Practically the only shipping we had was in the coastwise trade, built up under our coastwise laws. And if we had not built up that merchant marine under the coastwise laws, the result of the war might have been far different. Completely agree with him on this, by the way. If we didn't have that core fleet that we could tap into, we would not be able to get troops, cargo across. If you look at the first 14 ships that bring over the 1st Infantry Division over to France, one of them is involved in the transatlantic trade, passenger vessel to Finland. 2 are down, are basically banana boats that work down to Cuba and the Caribbean. And then the other 11 are ships in the coastal trade. And those become the core that are used. Jones goes on to say, how did Great Britain build up her merchant marine? She built it up by saying that goods from her colonies should not be brought into Great Britain except under the British flag and in British ships. Cabotage, protected trade. She continued that policy for years and years until she had built up the merchant marine. Then she removed those restrictions. This is an argument you hear about the Jones Act all the time, the Merchant Marine Act, is that it should be repealed because the British repealed it. Well, the British did it when they were the dominant force in shipping and basically could control it. Also, the technology was in their hands. Jones goes on to say, we want to build up our merchant marine and foreign trade, the overseas trade. We had no such merchant marine when the war broke out. Ships alone do not make a merchant marine. They must have cargoes. They must have traffic. They must have business, or they'll be laid up or be sold to foreign countries. Routes must be established and trade developed to maintain them. And so these 3 men basically hash out the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And what they do is put together this maritime strategy. We're going to sell off the ships of the U.S. Shipping Board. We're going to create these essential trade routes. We're going to put American ships on them. We're going to ensure that the coastal trade is protected. And most importantly, we're going to create this cadre of vessels that in time of war will be necessary to support the military. And lo and behold, they do exactly that, because what happens in World War II is that's the core of the fleet that will become the transportation for the arsenal of democracy. It doesn't do any good to build everything in the United States in factories up and down the United States if you can't transport them from the home front to the battlefront. And that is the core that's created with the Maritime or the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. It goes hand in hand with naval strategy and naval construction, so that in World War II, you amend this act with the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. There's also one back in 28, but the Merchant Marine Act of 1936 further, starts building more vessels, gets the shipyards back up and running, so that when you need to transition from building cargo ships to warships, you can do that with the Naval Act of 1940, the Two Ocean Navy Act. And the U.S. now is set to basically have a maritime strategy. But what happens? How does the U.S. go from being number one at the end of World War I, largest Navy, largest merchant marine, to today, largest Navy, 21st merchant marine in the world? Well, how America got to where it is today from the end of World War II is time for another video, because this one's going too long. But I want to leave you with this: how the maritime profiles of nations like the United States and China differ. This is from the United Nations. This is from their Conference on Trade and Development. And they do these maritime profiles for different nations. And you can pull it up. It's a great link. I'll give you the link to it. But one of the things they have in here is they have general information, but they also have the maritime key figures right here, where they talk about shipbuilding, size of fleets, fleet ownership. And right down here, and I'll move up here and give you a little bit, the world shares for 2020, which I think are really the big ones here to kind of compare the two. And you can see where the big differences are between them. Population, obviously, China is much bigger than the United States. If you look at the gross domestic product, the United States is the biggest, almost 25%. China, a little over 17%. But then you start looking at exports, and you can start seeing the amount of percentage there. But then you get into fleets, and you start seeing national flag fleet ownership. And it just begins to really expand. Shipbuilding, for example, U.S. shipbuilding is only 0.12% of the world. China's 40.26%. Get down here into seafarer supply, and you get into here to container throughput. And most importantly, get down here into international maritime trade. And if you look at the international maritime trade, for example, China has a trade surplus. You're looking at a trade surplus there in millions of dollars, over 535 not millions, but $1 billion right there. That's how much their trade surplus, and it increases. Whereas the United States has almost $1 trillion deficit in its trade, and it's decreased, and it's still going down, minus 12.9%. And you see it trading. This is a big thing. This is the element that we start talking about. And the United States not only has this trade deficit, but one of the reasons I would argue it has a trade deficit is because we don't do a lot of our trade on American ships. LNG, which we export, oil, which we export, goods, commodities, food, you name it, that we export is not going out. And if you look at the export structure by products, right here, you can see what is being exported: food, ores and metals, fuel going out. All these goods, whereas China is basically exporting manufactured goods. 94% is all manufactured goods. Whereas we're seeing manufactured goods as a big percentage of ours, but also fuels, ores, and food. Just again, this is the big difference that we're seeing. And again, one of the things that we're allowing to happen here is literally 100 years after the passage of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. Again, it's 2021, so 101 years. We're seeing a situation similar today to what we saw back then. U.S. goods piling up in the docks. We're really at the mercy of these foreign shipping companies to move our goods. We're trying to initiate legislation. This is John Garamendi and Dusty Johnson's legislation they're trying to do to amend the Shipping Act of 1984. But again, it's very difficult to legislate and regulate foreign companies. The U.S. is just deficient in this. And what we need is really a overhaul, a renewed maritime strategy, something akin to what was passed back in 1920. Again, a lot of people will argue, well, just repeal the Jones Act, get rid of that cabotage provision that prevents the use of foreign vessels in the coastal trade. But understand, again, that was only one element in a much larger maritime strategy. Arguably, it's one of the few elements that's left. The problem is the other elements that have been undermined over the 100 years that have been allowed to lapse by politicians, by shipping companies, by the military, by everybody, and for you who basically never really cared about where your goods came from, for good reason, because why should I care? This is the attention we need to raise. And that's one of the reasons why I do these videos. So I'll be following up with a video that takes us from the end of World War II to modern day. How did we get to where we are today? How did we have a national maritime strategy that worked to provide the fleet to transport the arsenal of democracy, 2 decades later during World War II, but then was allowed to lapse and come apart? Because that's a much longer story and a much longer video. And I know you don't want a much longer video. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos. Give it a thumbs up, leave some comments. I'm happy to answer questions on this. I know when I start talking about this generates a lot of issues and discussion. I had some great ones on Twitter. If you ever want to follow me on Twitter, @Mercogliano-S. I get in some great ones with people who disagree with me, and I try to have civil conversations with them and talk about it. But, I'm passionate in what I believe and what I talk about. So anyway, hope you enjoyed it. And until our next video, this is Sal signing off. Aloha.